Good morning for some of you, perhaps. And we are very happy to have here Sister Pat Murray. We had a very nice webinar with her and Father Tim Norton just a couple of weeks ago on interculturality. And many questions were pending and we couldn't answer. So we asked Sister Pat to give us one more time, 1 more hour to answer some of these pending questions. And others arrived through WhatsApp. So thank you very much for your participation. As usual, we start with a prayer. We have chosen 2 paragraphs from the Apostolic Exhortation of Pope Francis, Querida Amazonia. There are 2 paragraphs related with interculturality. We invite you to read it slowly by yourself. It's in English, but we have our translators translating for you in the other languages. To cultivate without uprooting, to foster growth without weakening identity, to be supportive without being invasive, Well, we invite you to read the old text because it's really inspiring. And now we are very happy to give the floor to Sister Pat to help us to better understand the challenge within religious life. We try to gather the questions that you send us, and we can say that the pillars are the leaders, the intercultural leadership, formation, the challenges within a community and the congregation. So Sister Pat will help us to go more in depth in these pillars. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are in the world. And I'm very happy to be with you to try and answer some of the questions which you posed after the last webinar. And maybe I'll give you a little bit of background to explain why I'm here at all, answering your questions. I studied at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, and part of the program there, when I began an MA in theology, one of the courses was on crossing cultures and also dealing with the whole area of interculturality. And I suppose living in Chicago and studying among a very diverse group of students, I became very interested in the topic, and that was even heightened to a greater level when part of the course was a visit to the Lakota Sioux Reservation in South Dakota, in Pine Ridge and St. Francis. And there we, if you like, the Lakota people were our teachers in terms of raising cultural questions and questions about faith and spirituality and belief and education. So that was the beginning of my journey. Then in the late 1990s, we had a general chapter. And at that general chapter, we made a commitment, and this is how we phrased the commitment, that we would become a multicultural international institute with one mission and one purse. Now we did that statement was done with the best of intentions, obviously, but obviously not having a lot of background in the whole area of interculturality. Because, for example, we were a multicultural international institute, and what we were desiring was we wanted to become an intercultural international institute, but we didn't have the language of culture, and we didn't have the language or understanding of interculturality. And then we made a very simple mistake. The rest of the phrase said that we desire to have one mission and one purse. Now, in using the term one purse, those of us gathered at the chapter meant a money purse, a purse in which we would keep our money. However, some years later, when we had a reunioning with our North American branch, they said, "What did you mean by one purse?" Because in the context of the United States, a purse means a bag. So here we had two different understandings of the meaning of purse. And it really opened, certainly for me, an understanding that the very words and terminologies that we use at times mean quite different things to different people. Subsequently, my experience in working with the Solidarity with South Sudan project, and more recently with the Migrants Project in Sicily, where we have men and women religious, certainly in South Sudan, from many different cultural backgrounds and many different congregations. And in Sicily, sisters from different congregations and different cultures. That also raised the whole question of culture. So my own search and understanding and my learning has began nearly 20 years ago. And I want to say I'm still on the journey. I'm still on the journey here at UISG, where we have many different cultures on the staff. And looking at religious life here in Rome and the diversity of cultures, the increased diversity of cultures, particularly at the level of general councils, points out to me that this is a very important area for our study. So that's the background to what I'm bringing today in answer to your questions. I hope I'll do them justice. I may not give you a complete answer to each question, but hopefully in the course of this afternoon, there will be sufficient material for you to use at community level and at congregational level. The first question somebody posed about community was, can you give concrete examples and good practices for intercultural praxis in the congregation? And here are some suggestions from my experience and from looking at what congregations have done. I think we need to take time to share about our differences with regard to culture. Time to share together important rituals in our culture and how we celebrate them. And we celebrate them quite differently, depending on where we come from. So it can be rituals about birth or marriages, deaths, how we share a meal together, what are special occasions in our cultures. It's interesting when you take time to share about important aspects of life that we get to know each other better. So that's one of the things I would suggest. It's a helpful practice. I think too we need to build up our own knowledge. We need to understand terms that are used widely in society, but to be quite precise about how we understand these terms. And these are terms that we'll find in culture, terms like race, ethnicity. What do we mean by stereotyping or prejudice? And what does prejudice look like in society or in a religious community? What does stereotyping look like or feel like? Often it's a feeling. I remember in my own work in my ministry in Northern Ireland in the 1980s, being quite shocked to learn that we learn our prejudices by age 7. That we've accumulated, if you like, a certain intuitive knowledge, often got from our family backgrounds or the environment in which we live, the community in which we live, and we know who are insiders and who are outsiders in our community. So, do we have prejudice? Do we have racism in our communities? Can we have honest conversations about that? We might often refer to phenomena like that outside in the wider society, but can we look internally? I came across a community who did a simple exercise. They took a statement as follows. They said, a member of a minority group may feel uneasy in my congregation. And then they were asked, do you agree or disagree with that statement, and why? And they could respond to this statement anonymously, and all they were asked to do was to indicate their age group. So when they gathered the fruits of their responses, that gave them, if you like, a template. They didn't know who had said what, but they had a number of very perceptive responses to that question in the context of their particular congregation. And that gave them material to talk about at the level of community. If you like, the statements they didn't know which communities or where these statements had arisen, they might guess, but it gave them serious matter to reflect on personally and communally. Other communities have developed case studies. I'm very aware of some wonderful work that was done by Father Frank Hoare, who's a member of the Columban Society of Priests. And they put together different case studies of actual happenings that had occurred where there was misunderstanding at a cultural level. And then presenting these case studies can be helpful to reflect on in the context of community. In some cross-cultural or in some multicultural contexts, it can be helpful to share the experiences in crossing into a new culture or in living in a multicultural context. It can be very helpful to share what we're grateful for. What have we learned that we really appreciated? And what do we miss? And what do we feel we have lost? Because in a way, there's a self-emptying when we leave our own culture and enter into the culture of another, but there's also an enrichment and a gaining. But I think as part of our journeys into becoming intercultural persons, we need to be able to note these. Moving on to another question. How to dialogue and negotiate in a congregation or community between low and high context cultures, Western perspectives and other cultures, and I and we cultures. I mean, that's an excellent question, but the first thing is it presupposes that each person in the community understands the difference between a low and a high context culture and understands the difference between an I and a we culture. Because in both of these typologies, there are different ways of communicating. In a low context culture, words are very important. In a high context culture, the whole ambience, the whole environment conveys the meaning. And the words often are less important than gestures, than facial expressions, body posture, silence, and so forth. In I and we cultures, in an I culture, I self-identify if I'm asked who I am. I'm Sister Pat Murray, so I'm claiming my I identity. In another culture, in a we culture, I would explain myself in relation to my family. I'm Sister Pat Murray, I'm the daughter of so-and-so, my cousins are, my extended family is, so I locate myself in a group. And therefore behaviors differ greatly, whether I identify myself as I, where I'm the point of reference, or where the community, the we, is the point of reference. So I think my response to that quite intricate question would be to say that we need to study the difference between I and we cultures, between high and low context cultures. And we need to see that they have different rhythms of sharing, different ways of communicating, different ways of placing the person. For example, there's a necessity to really allow time for space and for sharing, to make sure each person's voice is heard, or that each person has the opportunity to speak. They may not want to share at a particular time, but that there really is what often are called the need to create circles for listening and hospitality. Many of you may know the process known as the mutual invitation process, which is a way of asking somebody to speak when you've finished speaking and going around the circle so that each person has had the opportunity to speak or not. I've become very aware that often the processes we use in congregations, and I think I may have said this the last day, when we're selecting groups or nominating people, we often ask for volunteers. And I've become very aware that individuals from we cultures really don't put themselves forward. That's very much in the tradition of I cultures. But they're much more, they will engage in a process, in a communal process of deciding who should represent the group. And they're much more comfortable when it's the group has chosen them and send them forward. So I think we need to continually check the processes that we use at congregational level to see if people really feel involved, and to do that in a variety of ways. It could be through one-on-one conversations. It could be by really noticing body language or critiquing myself. For example, as a leader, I might say, could somebody give me advice on how I can do this better? So I invite, if you like, critique from others and help from others. And I think that's a way in which we can all grow. If we can create the kind of trust where we'll be given honest feedback and not be told what somebody thinks I want to hear. I'll never change or grow as a person if I'm just affirmed in my own, in a sense, blindness. A third question here asks about how to live healthily in an intercultural community. And I think the first thing is we shouldn't presume that because we're living together from different cultural contexts, that automatically creates an intercultural community. I think we saw the last day that creates a multicultural community, and we're on a journey towards becoming intercultural. I believe that interculturality is an area that requires formal study. I think we have to intentionally engage in studying. There are many interesting textbooks, and there are various tools that we can use. And I think we have to use those. For example, I've just assembled some books here that I have in my own library, Bridging Differences. I'll give you a list later on today, and we'll put it on the website for you. The Divine Word missionaries have developed a text called Intercultural Living, Explorations in Missiology. And they have a double text, which is in both English and Spanish, on intercultural mission, on intercultural living and intercultural. This volume 2 is intercultural mission. Now, I've been able to identify over the years a number of texts that have helped me. And unfortunately, these are in English, so I think those of you listening in from other languages, traditions, from Italian, Spanish, and French, you need to begin to search on the internet, look in libraries for articles or books that would help. But here are some that I'll mention quickly that have helped me greatly. Because one of the things that these texts do is they take very complex studies that have been done interculturally, and they applied them to religious life or to ordinary life. One of my big learnings was to see that some of the first studies in kind of practical interculturality, in a sense, was done by the big businesses. For example, IBM surveyed 40,000 workers. They had a Dutch interculturalist, Gert Hofstede, who's very interesting but very complex to read. And he did this study at the level of culture because they had seen they had difficulties when managers from one culture went to work in another cultural context. So they saw the need. And I said to myself, if big businesses see the need for this kind of study, then we religious need to take this study very seriously. So I would recommend books by Anthony Gittins, who's a Spiritan father. He has a text called Living Mission Interculturally, Faith, Culture, and the Renewal of Praxis. And then a very helpful little text, but a very important text, is by a writer called Patty Lane. And she writes, her text is A Beginner's Guide to Crossing Cultures, Making Friends in a Multicultural World. And the value of her particular text is that she has taken these complex concepts and translated them into ordinary life. There are some very interesting books produced by Eric H. Law. He has a book called Inclusion, Making Room for Grace, a Spirituality for Leadership in a Multicultural World. And he's applying the culture and interculturality to the context of parish life and to pastoral ministry. And there are others which we will send a list to you of various resources that you can use. I myself have been collecting resources over many years. And I think that we have to do that, and particularly those of you involved in formation. I collect articles, I collect all sorts of tools, questionnaires. I particularly use Milton J. Bennett's he has developed a developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. Various versions of his work can be found online. And again, that's particularly helpful. I gather articles, I look online, I look in various research periodicals, anything to do with culture. Here's one by Sister Marie Chin, which was in Origins way back in winter 2003. But her article is extremely helpful. It's towards a new understanding of cultural encounter in our communities. So what I think I'm saying to you is you need to develop resources that can be used at the level of community. I'm prepared to share the resources that I've developed to the extent that they're helpful. For my own study at Catholic Theological Union, I produced a study of 9 lenses for understanding culture. And I have a very simple handout sheet, which I will make available to you, which looks at various lenses. It looks at 9 lenses for understanding culture. For example, one author has said, it's a complex area. One author has said that if we looked at formation cultures since Vatican II, and he was writing at the beginning of the 2000s, he said there had been 9 different formation cultures. In other words, what he was saying is, it's Father David Couturier, he said there had been 9 different emphases within formation since Vatican II. So we're dealing with culture at a multiplicity of levels. Moving on to a question about fear. Somebody asked, fear may prevent us from having good intercultural relationships. And there's no doubt that fear may play a part. One of the characteristics of differences in cultures is that some cultures have high uncertainty avoidance and other cultures have low uncertainty avoidance. People from that culture have low uncertainty avoidance. What that means is that for some individuals and for some cultures, fear of the unknown is heightened. And in other cultures, there's a sense of excitement and adventure at fear of the unknown. So this is something, you know, when we're assigning sisters to new contexts, it's worth realizing that it's not just about personality, but something in our cultural makeup and our cultural sensitivity can prepare us more or less, and perhaps some need more help in entering new contexts and new situations. But I think we have to name our fears. Again, we're back to creating a context of trust and of openness with one another. You know, what are our fears in multicultural contexts? Sometimes it's the fear of making a mistake, fear of offending someone, a fear of looking stupid. I mean, all of us who've had to learn a new language, there's always the fear. I know myself, I began to learn Italian in my 60s. I suppose at that age, I was beyond feeling, I said, well, I have nothing to lose. I will just learn as best I can and speak as best I can. And that my efforts to communicate hopefully will be appreciated. And that was my experience. Not to be afraid of seemingly stupid or not having a capacity. In fact, I think I've come to learn that when you have less capacity and you reach out for help, particularly at the level of language or of culture, saying to somebody, can you explain this to me? That particularly in positions of leadership, this actually creates a mutuality where I'm making it very clear that I'm dependent on the other person. This is an area of my own life that I may have lots of experience in another area, but this is an area that I'm trying to grow in and learn. Perhaps I think our culture of religious life doesn't encourage us to make mistakes. Sometimes I think we have this culture of perfection. Whereas most of us, certainly most of my learnings in life and the significant learnings in life have been often made through mistakes or failures, through attempting something and not quite reaching the goal. So how can we help one another overcome fears? I think it's by being sensitive, not laughing at people or making fun of people when they make mistakes. Because if the first reaction you have when you're trying something new is that, you know, there's a negative, how you experience a negative reaction, I think it's to affirm and accompany others. How do we create an intercultural space in our communities? I'm a great believer that it's in honest conversations about things that really matter, that we learn about the other, and particularly learn about those who come from different cultures or subcultures. Don't forget that though we may all be from the one nation, we often have very different life experiences, whether we've come from rural or urban places, whether we've come, what age we are, the differences in ages and different experiences, our different life experience. So there's, if we can set ourselves up as a learning community where we're not adversarial, or we don't see ourselves as my position versus somebody else's, or my experience versus somebody else's experience, but the mutuality of experience that can enrich us all. And then I think it's helpful if we can share how our journey in a multicultural community is helping me or us to become more intercultural. If I can honestly share about practices or habits or ways in which I behaved that I'm now modifying because I realize in this intercultural journey that I'm called to change. I mean, that's the theological concept, that we're enriched and we change because of our interaction and our respect, our profound respect and our mutual love of the other. That you have something to teach and to change me, I have something that will teach and change you. But there is the challenge, as somebody put it, of the dominant culture. How can the dominant culture include minorities? And I think this is not easy, because we forget very easily which or what is the dominant culture. And we don't feel it's the dominant culture because we may say it's the congregational culture, forgetting that the congregational culture has often been shaped by its culture of origin. So there's a whole need to build gradually trust and respect and respectful relationships with those who come from minority cultures, and that it's not about the number of us who are in a particular community that come from a particular culture, but that each of the cultures present in the group have their place and space in terms of participation and leadership. And I'm saying leadership even at an informal level. Leading prayer, leading reflection, leading a working group, whatever. And that it's not about whether I have the facility of a language that gives me the role. And it's very easy for those from minority cultures to say, I'm not comfortable with the language, therefore I don't feel I can lead. I think it's for the whole group to say, together we'll help you. I mean, my staff here at UISG, they help me in my insufficiencies, because that's what creates community, when we reach out to support one another where there are gaps or lacks. So I think it's important to speak the truth to each other about to what extent I feel at home in this community. I mean, I can think of an example where in an intercultural community and an intercongregational community, when there were sisters from, I think, 3 different groups, but the symbols that were around the house were the congregational symbols of one congregation and not of the other 2, because that one congregation had more members present in the house. But it took quite a length of time before those 2 other sisters in the minority cultures could say, we really don't feel quite at home here, because the symbols that are important for us in our spirituality and our congregational history are not present in this environment. So the basis really was creating the relationship of trust, where one felt that you could say it, and the sisters involved in growing together were able to reach the point where they could be honest about how they felt. I have a daily practice myself of what we call in religious life examine of consciousness. You know, how was I today? You know, where did I meet God in people and in life today? But I also ask myself the question, how did I do today at the level of growing to be an intercultural person? Where was I attentive and where was I not attentive? Where did I notice and where was I oblivious? And then I think a healthy practice can be for those in a dominant culture to honestly ask for feedback. And I think each of us in our own intercultural journey, we have to name our own cultural blocks. We all have prejudices. We all are racist. Often it's buried so deep that it's only on particular occasions that I realize I'm stereotyping or reacting in a way. But I think it's a practice that we need to build into our life so we become aware of our own blindnesses. Someone asked a question about an intercultural audit and having a tutor in the community. Of course, it would be a blessing if you could identify somebody who has experience in this whole area of cultural awareness and growing in interculturality. But I think also we can do our own intercultural audit on a very small scale by asking the right questions in terms of our multicultural living and our desire to grow in interculturality. I think if we can find articles in different languages, even if we come from different languages, get them translated and really reflect on them together. I think the whole question of language is a huge challenge to religious life now and will be even increasingly so into the future. And I do believe that our newer members in congregations must learn at least one other language. I'm working with women who know several languages, 3 and 4 languages, and equally I think we have to be very respectful. I've come across situations where, because somebody doesn't know one of the major, if you like, languages, English, Spanish, French, Italian, and Portuguese, and so forth, but may speak 5, 6 minor languages because of the part of the world she or he comes from. I think we have to appreciate the facility of language that people have, and that may have in what you or I might regard as minority languages. But I think I'm coming back to say, I've drifted a bit from that answer, that an intercultural audit can be around one question, where we audit ourselves over a period of time by asking fairly deep questions, which we prepare for before we come to a community meeting. There's no point in giving a question for reflection when we come in the door and meet together and we expect people to respond spontaneously. As we noted before, in some cultural contexts, taking time and reflection and building trust is important before one can answer at a level of depth. Somebody has well remarked that interculturality and intergenerational challenges often exist in the same community. And in a sense, I think we have to see intergenerational challenge as an intercultural challenge, because don't they say that every 5 years that there's a new culture is created? So how, you know, I say to myself periodically, you know, to what extent am I open to learning? And to what extent have I contact with younger people who will introduce me to the world of technology at levels I don't engage in and don't understand, and at many other levels. In a sense, it's a way of understanding. Culture gives us a way of understanding and framing the world. So we need to engage in conversations with one another so we understand the framework that different generations, how they interpret the world they're living in. I remember, you know, reading Paulo Freire and talking about the skills of reading and writing, and how well he described, in a sense, the challenge is reading is a code really for how do I interpret the world, and writing is a code for how do I feel I can engage in changing the world. Now, different generations, different cultures see themselves, they frame the world differently. They see themselves having more or less power in changing anything, and equally within generations. So the power distance dynamic is an important one to study in relation to religious life. Do I feel I have any influence or power to change the world? That comes from a cultural framework too, but also within a congregational culture. We may, in a sense, how do we shape our congregational culture into making sure that everybody can participate and have a role in changing or in reflecting on what needs to be changed. I think we have to see difference not as a threat, but as an enrichment. I go back to my first experience in ministry in the early 80s in Northern Ireland, where we had a very simple educational program to try and bring young people from the different religious traditions together. And the name of the program was Differences Enrich Our World. And I think that's something we have to really claim in religious life itself, because in the past, our emphasis was on conformity And now I think the gift and grace that we can bring to the world, and at a level of being prophetic, is to show that differences enrich. Differences of age, differences of culture, differences of theologies and so forth, difference of experience. There's a wisdom to be gained in listening to the other, whether young or old, no matter where the person is from. If I can approach the other and be open to the other person and she or he to me, there's a growth in our understanding, growth in perception, a growth in wisdom. Somebody has remarked that as a person who lives in a multicultural community, sometimes it's not easy to switch back and forth. And that's true. It takes a sensitivity of listening and attention and of acknowledging the different changes that I need to make. But I think as a depth of relationship is created within a very diverse community, I think there'll be less of a feel of, I have to make an effort around this. It becomes a way of being, it becomes a practice. Or I equally know when I'm not paying attention and I'm tired. And I think we acknowledge that and say, you know, I'm, you know, this is, I haven't listened very well, perhaps, because I'm tired at this moment. So that we pay attention to ourselves and to ourselves as we interact. I think it would be a shame if we felt, to use the English expression, that we're walking on eggshells with each other. I think we have to recognize that we won't always get it right and we will make mistakes. But I think when it's obvious that I'm making the effort to really be a companion to you and you're making the effort to be a companion to me, that we will appreciate the relationship that we're growing together. It does require personal maturity, interculturality. Somebody remarks here that sometimes it is the personality that does not facilitate the intercultural living. And that's true. It's not easy sometimes to separate what is personality and what is culture. And in a sense, sometimes we use both in order not to change. I've heard people saying, well, it's my culture, that's my culture. As if to say, well, I can't change, whereas we know that cultures change. When I go home to Ireland, I can see the cultural shifts. Or a person at the level of personality can say, well, that's just the way I am. So take it or leave it, as if somehow the personality couldn't adapt or change. I think both at the level of personality and the level of culture, we're being called to a greater maturity. And it's a journey. And we will get there. Again, an interesting reflection that the dominant culture in a congregation corresponds with the country of foundation. And this can make other countries suffer a lot. And that can be true when we don't separate what's the kernel and the core of religious life and what are the cultural accretions or the cultural practices or behaviors that have kind of become part of our congregational life and history, but are really not of the essence or not essential to it. My particular congregation is a branch of Mary Ward's congregation, and founded in Ireland. We had many missionary outreaches. I often joked and said, as Irish people, we were not colonizers in the traditional sense. but we colonized others culturally through our brown bread, our apple tart, and our Irish singing and dancing. Now, I'm being facetious about that, I'm joking about that, but there also behind that is that it's, you know, leaving your own culture behind and entering into the new culture is a challenge. The temptation always is to bring my own cultural perspectives and my own cultural practices with me. So I think as we move around the world and as, you know, we go, can we learn from the mistakes of the past? That it's not just a political colonizing that can happen, but there also can be a cultural colonizing. And where we don't allow the congregation, different parts of the congregation to interpret the founding charism in new ways. I mean, I was very touched within my own congregation when it was the Vietnamese sisters who are a relatively new group within the congregation, who were fascinated by Mary Ward, seeing her as a refugee. I had never seen Mary Ward at that point in my life as a refugee from religious persecution. Yes, I knew she was fleeing religious persecution, but I had never put the name, I'd never expressed it in terms of being a refugee. So I think it's important for us to look at different aspects of our congregational life and see what are the essentials, what are the cultural accretions, the add-ons that have come, and how we can allow the local culture to change and interpret the way that the congregation is in a particular place and at this particular time. Because the charism needs to be embedded in the culture. Therefore, the charism, which represents really a gospel way of life, we're embedding the gospel, this gospel way of life in the culture. This is the process that we know as inculturation. Patrizia is saying to me, we need a little break, and we'll give a small break for 3 minutes, and it allows me to get my breath, and I hope what I'm sharing with you is of some help, and maybe it's stimulating for you. Other questions? If it is, I think that's good. Then it's been successful in itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Pat. I think it's good to have 2 minutes of break before she will answer other questions. We can take a time of silence and try to highlight what struck most according with our personal experience about what we heard so far. So 2 minutes. we go to start again, and we invite you to write your comments or questions in the chat. If we are not able to answer today, we will keep it also for future meetings. And it might be good also to share this kind of questions and comments. To you, Sister Pat.
Just wanted to thank the translators for the good job they're doing, and I hope my pace is okay for you. Yeah. I'm moving on to a section on intercultural leaders and questions about being a leader in an intercultural community. I think I want to emphasize again, it needs formation and training for the leaders. I think the leader can help the community celebrate difference, and the leader also can help the community to engage in an exploration of what it means to be intercultural. I think, to show the importance in the life of the church and in the life of the world today. And I think the leader needs to help the community to evaluate periodically, how are we doing, both in our living and in our ministry. I think one of my learnings as a leader in different leadership roles has been to understand that different cultures show respect to authority in different ways. It's not better or less good, it's just different. So for some cultures, the appreciation of a leader is shown in very formal terms. In other cultures, it's much less formal. And I think as a leader, I have to accept both, in the sense appreciate that this is the cultural diversity that's within the congregation. Now, as a congregation, we may have our own culture in terms of how leadership is exercised, and we need to examine that. Because I think if our overly formal structures actually prevent the growth of real relationships of trust, then I think we have to examine those. So it's to move to a level of really feeling at home together. A question around a receiving or local community, what it can do to welcome people from other cultures. I think we have to learn to be a host and learn to be a guest. Father Tony Gittins has written quite extensively on this topic, and because in a way, when we're a guest in another culture, we have to accept the fact that that's not our culture. No matter how long we're there, and no matter how familiar we are, we're still guest. Equally, the receiving culture has to learn to be a host. And the host is not just that the person you expect, the person coming to assimilate and to, in a sense, become absorbed in the new culture, but that also that person is allowed to be her cultural self within the receiving community. So it's a very delicate balance. Father Tony Gittins talks about moving from invitation to inclusion to radical welcome. And he has a very helpful chart in his text on living mission interculturally. And it's something that would be very good for reflection on at group level or community level. I think when a new person anywhere, we would say this about community life, when a new person joins a community, from whatever cultural or age group, that person, we form a new community. So we have to begin again to see how there's space for everyone within the group. It's not the same as last year's community, and we expect the newcomer to integrate into the way we've always been doing things, but that together we begin to say, how do we want to be in this group at this time this year? And to prepare intercultural leaders, it really depends on the context. Again, I keep saying, because I look at my own life journey, it's an ongoing process of study and reflection and experience and evaluation. So I'm aware that a person who's moving into leadership, and in a way I would say every member of a religious congregation is a leader in one way or another. So it's an attribute we want to, it's a capacity we need to develop in every sister to a greater or lesser extent that she is able to make this journey. But I think particularly for younger people, and I relate this really to formation, from the very early stages of formation, there needs to be a study of culture and becoming an intercultural person. And equally, there needs to be the theological and biblical underpinning of this. To be an intercultural person is a theological concept. I mean, when you look at the book of Ruth in the Old Testament, and the journey of Ruth and Naomi and their different experiences and the adaptation and also the blockages that were there, it's a wonderful text to read from an intercultural perspective. But I think for me, one of the texts that really, I think, changed my life was by, it's a text called Marginality by a Korean pastor in the United States. And he wrote on marginality. And he looked at Jesus, the marginal person, the self-emptying of God, of his godness in order to enter into our human condition. Though he was of God, he did not count equality with God, and so forth. So in the sense that this is a spiritual journey of self-emptying. So it has a spiritual underpinning. It's not just learning techniques and acquiring tools and reading articles. It's a way of living, it's a way of being. And it's a way of being where I will make mistakes, that I have to improve, I have to change, but that I'm always discerning where am I on this journey of really being part of the reign of God where all are valued. And this is a lifelong journey. So I would be saying the preparation begins certainly within religious life. At the moment of joining a religious community, this should be part of formation and ongoing formation. There are courses and there are workshops. One of the things I appreciated at Catholic Theological Union, where they were training priests for mission, was that several religious orders had this. This was part of their seminary training, that it was an essential part of needing to have an experience in another culture and also having to participate in workshops that would open one to the whole challenge of intercultural living. So I think we have to offer the opportunities for lifelong training and development in this area. A question here about attention and care of a superior in an intercultural community. And I think it's true that there are demands made when one is paying attention to the intercultural dynamics within community. And I think my own sense is that a leader of such a community needs a supervisor, and that's somebody apart from a spiritual director, but somebody who can accompany the leader in assessing how she or he is doing in terms of leadership of a multicultural group. What is he or she noticing? Where are the tensions or the conflicts? How might these be resolved? What kind of analysis might be needed to see what's the root causes so that the group doesn't faction? So I think that could be helpful at the level of having a supervisor, perhaps a supervisor who has some background in the area of culture and interculturality, but at least somebody who really understands the dynamic of groups. And I think, you know, all leadership, all leaders are called to pay attention to the dynamics of a group and the care of the individuals, but also the care of the group. And I think we need, whether it's a multicultural group or otherwise, I think the self-care of a leader of a group, both their personal self-care and noticing what they need for themselves, and sometimes it's to get away and where there are no demands being made of one, and to get away to a place where one feels really at home, where there can be a period of relaxation and restoration. So I think that's something that a leader has to pay attention to herself. What are my needs? Where am I finding the demands? What's the supervision I need? And what's the rest and relaxation and the restoring experiences that I need so that I'm the best leader I can be in this context? Leadership as mentoring. Somebody has asked the question here. Mentoring really can be a method of, somebody has described it as semi-structured guidance, where a person shares their knowledge, their skills, and their experience to assist others in their life's role. So in a way, a superior or a leader as a mentor, often as leaders we can mentor others, or others can mentor us by sharing their experience and their experience in particular contexts. And therefore, in the area of interculturality and in multicultural contexts, it can be helpful to share with others who have a similar experience, where we can mentor one another. However, the mentor needs to be accessible, and mentoring to happen on a fairly regular basis, so that I'm reflecting on my own practice and experience, but learning from the wisdom of somebody else. There's a question here about how to heal intercultural wounds. My own reflection on this is twofold. One is we can prevent old wounds from being healed by constantly retelling the story of the hurt. And I have come across cases where within a congregation, if you like, past hurts, and sometimes at the level of culture, when there was an experience of cultural, could be named cultural oppression within a congregation, or cultural oppression or political oppression within the society, where there's a real reluctance to move towards healing. Now, Father Robert Schreiter has written extensively on reconciliation. And in a sense, this is a whole area where we're called to be reconciled, but in order to move towards reconciliation, we have to engage in truth-telling. We have to tell the truth about what happened and how that particular experience over time was felt as to be oppressive, and why. Because in a way, we're calling on the other to acknowledge that oppression. The challenge is that often the past oppression, or the people who were there, are no longer with us. So I often think of the biblical verse of the sins of the fathers and mothers pass on to the next generations. So in a way, sometimes I feel that we of this generation, we have to minister to one another to heal past hurts. So in other words, in the context of truth-telling, the truth that has been heard or has been experienced needs to be told. And those hearing the truth, though they may not have been present in that context ever, have to acknowledge the hurt and claim responsibility of the previous hurt and ask for forgiveness. But then I think there needs to be generosity in letting it go, in letting the past hurts go, and ritualizing the letting go of past hurts can be helpful. Ritualizing the act of accepting responsibility for the past in order that the future might be abundant in loving grace. And this is a prophetic witness that's needed in our world today, because the past hurts can be recounted forever. And at some stage, the healing process has to be engaged in, or the fractures and the divisions will continue with even maybe sadder consequences into the future. I think our prophetic living is called to be intentionally intercultural. And I think, yes, we're living in a multicultural world, but for many, there isn't an intention on building bridges and of creating harmony and of healing past hurts. And I think that's the role of religious life today and into the future, that we who are many and from many different cultures and contexts and places can demonstrate that we can live together, enrich each other, and accompany one another. That was my great learning in South Sudan. I think I said that last time, but yes, they were grateful for the education. They were grateful for what we brought in terms of our expertise and our abilities. But constantly, the people said, how do you from different tribes live together? So the very diversity that was before their eyes was a witness of the reign of God coming among us, where we who are different in our diversity can cause a flourishing that many can benefit from. Interreligious dialogue through the lens of culture, because obviously religion becomes and culture become intertwined, and there's no doubt that in engaging in interreligious dialogue through the lens of culture and how different religious faiths are embedded in different cultures and how they are expressed through those cultures can be another way of gaining mutual understanding and of building bridges between us. Somebody remarks here that, you know, there is a big challenge when when you have a multicultural context outside the community and a multicultural context inside the community. And again, I'm back to saying diversity enriches the whole, and we can model something to the outside that relationships are really possible, not superficial relationships, but relationships at depth are possible. And that within our faith dimension, that this is the call to the flourishing of life that Jesus calls us to, for each person and for all. And that justice as right relationships, right relationship with God, with our neighbor, with the environment, with myself, calls me to be part of the creation of this just community that shows forth God's reign in the world. Colonization has surely had an effect, but I think we need to claim the positive and the negative sides of colonization. Sometimes it's only the negative that gets raised up. And yes, that often has left wounds we need to heal, but also there are many treasures, many aspects of life that have been enriched through the experience. And I think in the context of right relationships, we have to acknowledge both. And I think we have to name both and confront both in order really to not allow things to fester into the future, as I said earlier, so that hatred can be fermented and divisions will continue. But I think the effects of colonization, and there have been many texts written on this, is how again to move towards reconciliation and forgiveness for past hurts or even present hurts. How to engage, and it's not simple. I'm not going to say this is simple, but how to create bridges of dialogue rather than let the situation descend into violence and sometimes conflict and war. To be agents of reconciliation and healing and bridging of difference and understanding of difference is not easy, but it's the path to which we're called. And the last section of questions were on formation. And in a way, many of the things I've said through this past hour and a half, you've been very patient with me. You heard me say from the beginning of religious life, this is an area in which we need to be formed. At individual level, group level, community level. We have to move into the new future, which is one of luxurious diversity within religious life. But without education, theological reflection, experience, and honest reflection, we won't move into that future. The Vatican document, New Wine and New Wineskins, point out clearly that this emerging, in some cases emerging, multicultural living, but in many cases it's been there, but the call now is to this much deeper level in terms of understanding interculturality and its challenge to us as religious leading a prophetic life. So I will leave you with my simple attempts to try and share my own experience, my own learnings, just to say as I conclude that it's not a journey that's over for me. Every day I probably acknowledge my inadequacies in the area, but I keep reading, I keep trying to keep up to date in the research and also in the learnings that are done outside of religious life and within religious life, now that there are many excellent resources emerging on bringing theology and biblical understanding to this whole concept of interculturality. Let us accompany each other on this journey, and I would hope those of you who have resources out there in the different languages would share those resources with us, so that together we can compile books, films. I didn't get into the whole area, but often there are excellent films that can help grapple with this whole area. And within the different language traditions that we identify texts or tools that could be helpful in our ongoing growth and development. Thank you very much for being with me, and God bless you on this intercultural journey which we're all engaged in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sister Pat. We are making a virtual applause to you. Thank you because you share with us your biography, your story, and your experience as religious leader involved in intercultural context most of your life. I just want to make echo of a couple of things. The first thing is dialogue. To create healthy communities, healthy space, we need to nurture dialogue. And the challenge to become host and guest. I think this is something that is for community, but at the same time for our society. So thank you very much. Thank you again. And as you know, the interculturality is one of the USG priorities, came up from the last plenary in 2019, so we will continue. That's why we plan another meeting for March 24th, where we'll be presenting this book that came from the African context, from a Sister Chiniaka. So she will be with us. She's studying in Rome. So she will be with us to tell us more about her book and how it came up, and I mean, what's her learning about that. So March 24, we will send you as usual the invitation very soon. I don't know if you have written something in our chat or comments. We will take care of that. You still have a couple of minutes to do it, even though we cannot talk right now. We will keep it for the future. So thank you very much. Thank you again, Sister Pat. And keep up and keep working on this issue, because it's very important. Thank you very much to all the participants, to my colleagues, Sister Florence, Sister Teresa in the technical side, and our translators. Have a nice day.